I think I have one phobia, which has a different name. It could be scopophobia or farmer phobia. Anxiety about someone watching me and seeing it as a sign that I have a strange obsession. On each occasion when I see a doorway, window, or any other surface behind which I think a person might be lurking, I visualize their face. The moment I look at the face looking back at me, I can visualize what I would do and what actions I might take. Friends, I think you will soon find out the reason for my phobia. So let's get to the story in which I will try to tell you about it. Memories. I can't remember all the details, but my mind was able to suppress some of them. In June 2016, when my mom and I lived in a small apartment, there was no basement or attic, but there was a way to live in it. The tiny space under the closet floor in my bedroom was not part of the basement or attic, but I never looked in there. I feel like some of the people would be curious, but my mind refuses to accept it. I already had the worst-case scenarios in my mind, so I decided to abandon the plan. There were ghosts and dead bodies present, which were essential for whoever would rent the apartment after us. We had spent a few quiet months there before the noises started. Unusual noises, nothing big, just incomprehensible noises and nothing more. My mom, noticing the scratching on the walls and the other damage, figured it was rats or something had made a nest there. There was no reason to get rid of them for a week or two. I was used to it by now. I had developed a habit of the noises. In fact, they became something of a sedative for me. I was never one for silence until one night I heard it in my sleep. A different sound that was so similar to the one my closet made when I opened it. I involuntarily flinched. With difficulty, I was able to open my eyes and look around, but saw nothing in the pitch darkness. In the darkness, I thought it looked like something was moving in there, but I knew for a fact that it wasn't. How the mind tricks you in the dark, but there is only one way to find out. With that in mind, I decided to use the lamp. However, when I turned on the light, all I expected to see was a dim light. I saw a closet that was full of coats. But what I saw was much worse than I expected. Tu saw only one eye and half of his face, which was barely distinguishable in the tiny slit that formed after he opened the second. And he didn't even express his displeasure at being caught, not a shadow of emotion on his face, just stared, and my heart never beat so hard. I wanted to scream or hurt him or do something else, but I realized that would be too quick. Showing impatience. She just stared back and couldn't contain herself any longer until she reached the peak of her patience. "What do you want?" It was said in a tone as if she was trying to ask someone. "What do you want?" I couldn't understand what you wanted, but my sobs drowned out your words. And he opened the door even more so I could see his face. His whole body, which I can't describe because I spent 2 years trying to forget that face. He asked me to be quiet. And I felt my breath catch when I heard his voice. Everything around me became real, and it was impossible for me to lie to myself that it wasn't a dream. Eventually, I came to the conclusion that it was just a fucking hallucination, and that was the end of it. I was standing with my back against the wall when he said, "It's okay, I'm calm." And it sounded so happy that it sent shivers down my spine. Always when I think back on it, it was actually at that moment that I finally realized my courage and decided to leave the room. It made me feel uncomfortable the moment I left the room when my mom came out. During the dream, she called the police and assumed that I was still in the place. When the police arrived, he was already gone. That was all that was left of him. I was unable to get into the damn basement that was there, and I am writing about it now. I regret very much that I don't have any evidence of it, and I can't understand it. This will probably be a comfort to me, because in this case, you all will know that I am not alone. In any case, I'm not crazy, and he did live there. But for how long, I can't say for sure. I was in the basement at the time of the incident and found footprints there. However, the officers who arrived on the scene reported that they were only shoe marks. I was not interested in how many there actually were, nor was I interested in whether or not he was counting the days. I wanted to leave that apartment within a few days, and we accomplished that. The search never found him, but the police don't think they were sure he was there. We found a homeless man who looked like the one described in his characterization, but he apparently didn't show us the proper interest. I always thought it was due to his lack of experience. They didn't take it all that personally because they just assumed he was a squatter, even after I told them about him knowing my name. They figured that given the amount of time he spent squatting and how long he was able to sit like that, he probably heard my name through his hearing. That night, he became the face I always see when the door opens. I always get a chance to see it when a door or closet is open. Afterward, it began to look more distorted, but I can always distinguish his compressed lips, as if he still retains the ability to speak. At this point, it has gotten easier over time, but I don't think you realize it. I know you'll never be able to leave me completely, but still, I don't think we've ever really had that together. Mice A double-decker white van. On screen or in movies, villains usually move around in white or black vans. I didn't realize this until I decided to get myself a 1994 Dodge Ram. The van has everything I need in it to get the job done while I'm in the process of transporting it. I have had 3 instances of police officers pulling me over for no reason, but that is another story. This fact is due to the fact that some people think vans are just suspicious. As I was returning home, a woman carrying a stroller stared at me intently as I walked down my street. I had a lot of expensive, delicate equipment in my van. Because of this, I was moving very slowly and she was looking at me with interest. During the whole time I was watching her wide-eyed, she smiled at me like a friendly neighbor does. She was watching so intently that the stroller almost flew off the curb. It seemed funny at first glance, but I forgot about it a week later when an email scandal broke out in our HOA. Information came out that a man in a white van was harassing a woman with a child. He sent an email notification. I claimed to be a resident of the area and a white van driver, and the mister accused me of being too clumsy. I responded to the wall by saying that I also live in the area and am in the trucking business. I am aware that I made a mistake with my license plate number and residential address. I added that I had witnessed a suspicious type in the area. At the sight of this woman with a stroller, I felt fear. She looked at me so intently, and for such a long time that I felt uneasy. After I provided the date and time of the incident to see if their alleged stalker was actually me, he was found and identified. He became really hysterical and started writing me letters one after another. As he claimed on the list to be able to read between the lines of what I was saying, his accusations became more and more valid. Over time, they began to seem not only ridiculous, but escalated into personal attacks. In response to complaints from neighbors via email, he began to behave inappropriately. As a result, the emails eventually stopped, but they still keep coming. I can say that the situation has gotten even more bizarre in several situations, and now I'm walking around with it. As I left the house, a girl of about 10 years old leisurely approached me and started chatting about my pet while sharing various intimate details of her life. Random intimate details of her life. I was surprised that this child was telling me such things. I accidentally entered into a conversation with strangers and assumed she just knew me from the neighborhood, so I politely reciprocated. My daughter came to my house and told me that her father was the reason for her anger. Due to the fact that I do not allow her to have a dog like mine, she wants to stay with me for a while. I tried to explain to her that I need to talk to her parents before I will allow her to visit my house like this. After she expressed her agreement and left, I never saw her again. A friend of mine who has 2 daughters told me about one of them being his friend's daughter. One of their mutual acquaintances informed me that the girl who had contacted me was the daughter of one of the people who was on the HOA mailing list. Apparently, he had sent her to talk to me and take pictures. My daughter had a friend who was friends with the decoy girl. However, the poor girl's father did not accept her friendship. Being the poor girl's father, he could not provide a decent life for her and therefore constantly embarrassed her. Therefore, she told her friend that the father had sent his daughter to a training course for he could accuse me of something, but I can't even imagine what exactly. I can't even remember what little thing I forgot to mention. I have video cameras on all my cars and video surveillance outside my front door. Both the initial incident with my wife and the girl who came to see me were recorded in the process. I sent a message to the man who had the trigger, I suggested that he review the videos of each incident. I also let him know that I was concerned that his daughter might have been involved in similar incidents. His plan was ruined as he behaved in a defiant manner towards strangers. Subsequently, I never heard from him again. Near Munich, I grew up in a village. Bridge. In the southern part of Germany, one could find the safest and most peaceful place on earth. Some young families trying to escape the unreasonable rents in the city, and a few elderly people struggling with it as well. Not far from my parents' house, there are several places where you can find elderly people fleeing it. There is a small conservation area within a few kilometers of the forest border that covers about 2 to 3 square kilometers. There are several small lakes in the maze, the entrance to which is forbidden, but there is no path leading to them. One always stays within the area, which can be very desolate and wet, which is often the reason for the lack of interest from other people. Despite the fact that no one would go into the outback, I was always interested in unusual and frightening places. While I played outside alone, my students started exploring it. It became a favorite playground for me. I remember that I was 9 years old at the time. In the woods, I discovered a small clearing that was covered with a flowering meadow. Udonis Leia, located at the end of summer, was like a paradise for me for the next year. I wanted to be alone when I needed time to read, draw, and daydream, and as I got older, to do creative work. The whole time I was doing nothing but sunbathing and doing other things. I didn't want to tell anyone what I was doing all that time. During all those years, I never noticed any sign of another person's presence in the meadow. It was my little secret, and I felt safe in the Hope years. When I first went there at that time, I needed to do some reading and sunbathing, but since I didn't notice anyone, I was naked most of the time. At that moment, I apparently fell into a dream, and when I woke up, I saw the world around me in a dream. At that moment, I saw in front of me an elderly, maybe 50-year-old man sitting directly across from me. He was about 6 feet tall, dressed in light clothing and carrying a camera. He had a camera around his neck. I experienced the shock of a lifetime and tried to hold back a scream. It was impossible to cover myself as all my clothes were hidden. So the only option for me was to huddle on the ground. I asked him to look at me, and that made him realize how good I was and how happy he was to see me again. To help me, I asked him to turn around and let me grab my clothes, but no, you don't have to do that. I just want to interact with him a little bit, so I asked him to tell me about his life. Random questions about my life like, what is my name and where I live? What are my plans for the future? Questions about boys and their behavior, I tried to answer briefly and succinctly. In spite of this, he was not going to leave me. After a while, he even asked me to take a couple more pictures, as I looked like a nymphomaniac. And he expressed his desire for me to stay with him forever. I didn't oppose him, but at the moment I feel insecure about it. There's been a change in his behavior. He's become more aggressive, and it's reflected in his face. And you know, I'll never forget that phrase, spoken with such a cold tone. I get the impression that you're too naive for a little naked girl in the woods like this to be here right now. I jumped up like hell and ran into the woods, forgetting all my stuff. He didn't pay any attention to that. There was no attempt to chase me, he just enjoyed laughing while sitting there. Upon my return, I spent about 2 hours on the road trying to get my stuff. Unfortunately, he was no longer in sight. He left with his stuff and left only one thing behind, a t-shirt. Grabbing the hem of my skirt, I gathered all my stuff and tried to hide behind it. After I was done, I ran home as fast as I could. I didn't bother to tell my parents what had happened. I then decided never to visit that meadow again. There is a young man in a wheelchair getting around. This is where I grew up, and I was lucky. I grew up in a good neighborhood where all the families were friendly and did activities together. We were in the same school and all the teachers knew us. We were free to walk around as long as we left the house before the streetlights came on. Everyone there was known to us, or at least we recognized them when we met them. This is where the wheelchair-bound guy comes into play. He was well known, often walking the streets, although he actually lived in a house that was on the same street as himself. There was no contact with him. He was completely focused on his group of friends, which always made me wonder. But it never gave me any reason to doubt his competence or anything like that. The meaning of the word was busy. My sister and I were ages 6 and 10, and we were out riding our bikes as usual. I immediately knew something was wrong when a guy in a wheelchair turned onto our street. My intuition told me it was for a reason. I decided to pull over and let my sister, who was riding ahead of me, know. But then the guy picked up speed and shouted to us that he owned the car. I immediately started telling him that we couldn't help him and that we needed help ourselves. He keeps repeating about how I do need help and is asking for help. My sis asks me to text home as soon as possible, but this guy refuses to honor her request. The moment he started chasing us, we jumped off our bikes and ran to the house to tell my dad what happened. My older cousin and I went to his house as he was in the company of his friends outside. My father yelled out to us to stay inside. Apparently, my father shot him with a gun and demanded that he never look in our direction again. Needless to say, from that time on, every time he saw us, he pretended his ass was in motion. On the other side of the sidewalk. To better understand what is around me, I am originally from Kentucky. There are a lot of forests here, and people here love guns. That includes me. I couldn't imagine encountering something unknown in the woods. I thought it was Bigfoot. There is a possibility that it could be real. However, I wasn't sure until this moment, after the event occurred, and now I know for sure that it is reality. There is something incomprehensible about it. I just purchased my first AR-15 style rifle. I chose a .556 caliber Ruger rifle and a 60-round magazine for it as my weapon of choice for many purposes. She opened her store in the Gander Mountain Shopping Center, but they were going to close it because they didn't understand why Srays misread their name. After reading the article on Tumblr, I realized it was an amazing phenomenon. A person rarely had a problem with it, and it would make a difference in a few days. It was right where it was supposed to be after I received it. I decided to give it a test drive, for which I reframed my gun a little better. As I've said before, Kentucky is a very beautiful area that includes 3 huge tracts of forest. About 3/4 of the area I lived in was covered in dense forest. There are a few trails in the forest that were created by our cows for alligator travel. Other than that, however, there was nothing to see. It occurred to me to take a walk along a creek that had a small path leading to it. It was in a small area that had been partially cleared by cows. At the end of the path is a large field, where we usually graze our cows and where my fixings are when they are not there. After I climbed over the fence to head into the field, I immediately realized that I was being watched. I had noticed I was being watched a long time ago, but I didn't pay attention to it, because I was already past that point. I can say that this has happened to me thousands of times before, and I've never experienced any anxiety, so I keep moving forward. I try to ignore the feeling of being watched, but at the same time I feel very anxious about it. I know I am uncomfortable with being watched, but I haven't made a big deal of it. Some kind of special attention needs to be drawn. It was a walk to the field along the creek. The end of the walk was short. I walked for about 2 minutes at a slow pace. But the farther I walked, the faster I moved. I felt like a god, and I was getting closer to whoever was watching me. About halfway through, the feeling became so strong and all-encompassing that I could no longer ignore it. The drum magazine I had with me appeared to be empty, so I stopped and began to load it. I only had 20 rounds of ammunition with me. Paying attention to the fact that I just wanted to fire the gun, and 20 rounds should have done me good, so now I don't pay much attention to that anymore. Watching what was going on around me and loading the magazine at the very moment I started to make the first move to insert. After I put the rounds into the drum, I smelled a strange odor that was like the smell of something dead. At that moment, I noticed something rotting in the sun directly behind me. Turning around, I saw what it was. In what was left of the possum, it was almost completely destroyed. It looked like it was in pieces. In fact, it looked as if it had died. I seemed to have only been in a state of death for a few hours, but what I felt seemed to be much more real and intense. It always works. That didn't satisfy me, and I double-checked that it was working. I had to accept the dead possum as a sort of gift of fate, and so I made the decision to continue on the path, even though I never had any plans for the future. I made the decision to move forward despite the fact that I never had any problems with the place, so I figured my brain was just paranoid or something. I got to the field when I was about to reach it. The moment I saw it, I was at the end of the creek, and I got the feeling that I was being watched. Just at that moment, being already at the very end of the creek and at the edge of the woods, I heard a splash of water. At that moment, I turned toward the sound, but my gun was at the ready, but there was no cartridge in the chamber. There was nothing in the chamber, and there was something going on in the creek that was far away from me that I had no way of detecting. I will never forget that it was about 8 feet tall. They were very skinny and tall. A humanoid creature. Imagine a man between the ages of 40 and 50 who is 120 pounds. Then you need to scale him up to the size of an adult male. He was within 8 feet of the floor, but his body did not change. He had very long arms and legs. It did not make any sound. It moved on 2 legs, and its skin was so thick that it did not allow air to pass through. It had an unusual gait. While diving into the stream, it made only a noise like splashing water. There was a possibility that it was able to move quite fast, but that could be due to the fact that it had an Ahmadi. It had a nice shade of light brown color. It resembled the coloring of a deer or boar. All I can remember now is how I realized why I felt and why I was being followed. I was aware of why I felt I was in danger and why I was ready to finish the cartridge in the chamber. You must remember what I told you earlier about the magazine being very reliable. I pressed the trigger in order to return the cartridge to the chamber in case it was not chambered. There was a huge creature approaching that could attack. I didn't plan on striking first or anything like that. Due to the fact that I was somehow stuck in the magazine, I was never able to get out of there. Due to the fact that I had never used this magazine before, it did not fail due to heavy use or anything else. The gun has enough force to break your finger, so I did what was necessary. The magazine worked, and the only thing I can think of is that the thing had something to do with it. I didn't bother telling them that the store was no longer working properly, and so I had to return it to Magpool. I just told them about the magazine not working several times. In doing so, the gun jammed on the first round, which usually happens most of the time. When he walked out of the building without making a move or uttering a sound, I had plenty of time to leave. To clarify the details I gave earlier, and now about the assumptions this happened. At the end of May this year, I am still receiving emails from Magpul. Using these drums as a reference for information on what this creature was, I want to know more. Myself and my friend, who knows more about what happened than I do, have speculated that it might have been related to some other incident. I realize that sounds like nonsense, but still. We believe it was a Wendigo because everything I've described matches them perfectly. There is a belief that they were very skinny and had a stench of death that followed them everywhere, which explains their odor in the air. The fastest of all the species. Their color can be either light brown or brown in color. For this reason, they sometimes kill other animals to scare people away. We couldn't think of anything better than his behavior. What reason am I still alive if this Wendigo really existed? Wendigos are supposed to be very aggressive, but while they watched me and took no action, they just watched. Didn't take any action, didn't try to harm me or resist me. It just disappeared out of my path like it was in a panic. It was either trying to lure me there, or it just wanted to show me where I needed to be. I didn't run into him again, and this time I walked to the same field. Along the same road I expected to be watched, but it didn't cause me as much excitement as that time. Since then, something was definitely present there. No one, including you or anyone else, can convince me otherwise. I have succeeded. If I'm fooling myself into thinking I'm being watched, there's no way it can compare to the day I was actually in danger. If any of you guys have had the opportunity to observe something like this, I would appreciate information about the case. I want to talk about it to vent my emotions, And I also apologize for the affair, guys, but I admit my guilt in this. I had a distinct feeling that I needed to address every little detail to explain the situation in more detail. I could look. These minor details give a glimpse of what I would have been like in reality. Lately, I began to notice that every little thing has the purpose of ruining my life. This situation happened a long time ago when I was 9 or 10 years old. I was at the beach with my parents, my family, and a family friend, Mines. She was 9 or 11 years old. We were about 11 or 12 years old when at some point my friend and I went for a walk. While our families were relaxing on the beach, we decided to explore the surrounding area. After relaxing on the beach, we went to the forest, which was a 5 or 10-minute walk from where our families lived. We entered the premises and found a lone man who was completely alone. He was older than us by as much as 30 years, and when he saw us, he smiled and approached us. Still, we stood and looked at each other without taking any action. But suddenly he started a conversation in which he touched on some topic. "Hi, I am a photographer from a modeling agency, and I couldn't help but notice your close attention. You two are perfect for a photo shoot," and he continued by saying that you and your companion would complement each other perfectly. According to him, he admires my friend and thinks she is very beautiful. He is confident that if we make a video, we can make a decent amount of money. My wife and I were initially very excited and told him that we just wanted to make sure their parents were healthy, but this is what started the conflict. Still, I hadn't really thought about something like that until he mentioned it until now. We were supposed to follow him and not say anything to our parents, but it wasn't far from us, and he kept convincing us that we should follow him. I began to notice that my friends began to regard my words about the money we could get if we just followed him without saying a word with disbelief. They declared that we weren't interested and started turning around, pulling my hair to make sure I was following them. At first, he just followed us, but then he started raising his voice and talking about how, if we followed him, we would definitely make a mistake. That we would be able to make so much money that my friend grabbed my hand really hard, and we just made a booking for the shoot. At that moment, he stopped following us and stopped saying anything, and when I turned back, we were already out of sight. I noticed his gaze directed at us with obvious dislike. After we told their families, some of the adults went to the place where we had reported his presence, but he had already left the place. I am grateful to my friend for being able to recognize that something out of the ordinary had happened to him. The situation we found ourselves in was not what we would have liked, because things could have turned out differently. It was so much worse. He tries to lick my leg. In 2014, I was just an ordinary teenager, a 17-year-old young man. I was at the Argos store that day with my friend, her friend, and her baby. It was a summer day, and I was there with my friends. I was of medium build and blonde. I was wearing shorts and tights. Due to the fact that I am curvy, I have to wear them to prevent the fluff that all girls who have developmental disabilities can get. I'm sure all girls with curvy legs can understand that, for those who are not from the UK, our stores are something of a zoo. After peering into a more depressing version of IKEA, we started discussing what we were not happy with. I had a friend who had another baby, so when we walked into the store and started looking at the assortment, she was also a mother. Right after we started looking through the catalogs, we were approached by a guy with 6-foot looks and bad breath who introduced himself by shaking my hand and saying my name loudly. In response to my handshake and loud declaration that my name was Round or something, we apparently thought it sounded weird. Due to the fact that he happened to be on the other side of the store, we had to just walk around him. We chose to ignore him and go back to where he was while we were standing in line, as I assume he was trying to communicate something to us in Polish or Russian. He left and I relaxed, watching his departure with my peripheral vision. I was sure he was gone, so I allowed myself to relax. It was time for a little chat, and remember that Mo was at the peak of my rebellious stage. There were some small tattoos among them, such as bows on the back of my thighs in the middle of my thighs, as if stockings were supposed to be there. Next, I realize that I am experiencing a moist sensation on the back of my leg, and I look down to see this strange man getting up and walking away after he performs the action. He licked my tattoo. I know I experienced shock when he left me after he finished. After he licked my leg for 15-20 seconds, the salesman called the police and I called my boyfriend. That day when I lived with my neighbors, the police came to my house. They came to talk to me and also wanted to know if they could take a DNA sample. They wanted to replace my leg, but I had already taken a shower. Luckily, my legs were ready to go. I decided to put them back where they belonged since they were still there when I threw them on the floor when I took off my clothes when I got home. I turned the pantyhose over to law enforcement, and within a week I was informed that the man had been arrested for licking. He received 6 months in jail and community service for licking several women's feet. Eventually, the man was sentenced to jail time. I'm glad he turned out to be such a weirdo, but I still commend him for it. In a state would have existed completely alone. But if I found myself in another place where I wasn't surrounded by people, I would feel quite comfortable. He was brazen enough to try something else. I was born and raised just north of New York City, in an area that is considered fairly densely populated. I looked forward to the summer when my father and I would go on vacation. We chose a place about an hour north of Lake George in the Adirondacks. They camped for a few nights during the summer utilizing the Adirondacks. As we approached the trailhead on the dirt road, we saw a vehicle on the side of the road. In the vehicle were several people continuing an argument near the car, and this is far from the most secluded place on the planet. The surprise of seeing a car parked here that had nothing to do with the real deal was endless. The moment we approached, he stepped out to meet us and waved. I assumed they were having car trouble, and my dad rolled down the window as suddenly someone yelled from the group, "Get away from him!" And the man suddenly took on a serious expression and started to walk away. My father was tall, well-built, and moved fast, so when he saw him, he hit the brake. After he quickly shifted the car into reverse, the men took a few breaths and stopped. We were just standing in the parking lot at a loss, and all of a sudden we noticed several men walking towards us. The moment we were 10 or so yards away from him, he suddenly darted off the road into the woods. We cautiously approached a parked car where 3 women were sitting in the seats crying loudly. Apparently they were his sisters, and he had returned home after serving in the army a few months before. According to the women, immediately after he came home from the army, he started behaving strangely. Subsequently, he began engaging in odd behavior that was related to his return, and he was diagnosed with PTSD. Due to the early onset of symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, the women decided to leave the car and go into town. Lastly, they indicated that they were heading to the ranger station to get help in tracking him down. We made it safely to our campsite and found a place to stay for the night, then began setting up camp for the rest of the day. However, my father and I had some unusual experiences while around the campfire. My father and I had vague premonitions, and we could not tell whether the women were telling the truth or not. It could only mean one thing: the men were telling the truth, or the men were asking for help. And what was even more disturbing was what they were trying to do. I think we were in a camp only a few miles from where the man hid. We couldn't tell for sure if he was armed or if he was following us. In our case, my father and I shared sleeping quarters in separate tents. Late in the evening, when my father and I were already sleeping in different tents, we made the decision to stay in one of them. From the outside, it looked like a small log house with 3 walls and an open entrance. It also contained a hearth for a fire. Neither of us slept in the open part where the fireplace was located for too long. During our first night together, I was sure we didn't sleep too much, but really that was just my imagination. The incident of being watched had happened, and I had heard something, though my father and I had not talked about it. Since morning, Father and I had not heard any footsteps or anything new. The next morning, as I left the tent, I saw in the distance a camp that was hundreds of yards away. It was on a path near a small campfire. I put my hand on the ashes and it was warm. This basically means that someone had recently built a fire here, and now it looked like it sucked. When I flooded it, we had enough food and water for 4 nights, but after I did that, we started having trouble with food and supplies. We set up camp and just left the next morning. I was about 11 or 12 years old at the time and living in Rhode Island. Being in small-town Rhode Island, I was surrounded by a pretty dependable life, but that's when I got my first computer, and that's when my independent life began. There was an occasion in my group of friends when we would go on the meme website together and talk about high school kids, regular boys. I don't know if there are any of you who remember, but there were people shooting. My love of public groups where you could make acquaintances with strangers. Stopped in to hang out. Then a group of my friends and I decided to start a group to play an online game. While we were laughing ourselves silly and sharing YouTube videos, a guy took an interest in me and added me as a friend. I think he was infatuated with me and added me so we could talk privately, but I don't remember that for sure. And yes, what we talked about. Really about school animation and my friends, looking back, I think. He was nice enough and showed interest in me, but I didn't notice anything strange about him at the time. I can't remember his name even though he's 2 years older than me. He is a 32-year-old black male. His residence took place in the state of Connecticut, which is not that far from where I live. I felt like I was going to meet him. I was young and he seemed very friendly. He was a few years older than me, and I was constantly bullied in school. Online seemed to be my salvation, because that's where he and I had conversations about Vocaloids and their use in medicine. For those who don't know what that means, it was a program that allowed you to make him sing any song or create your own. It was similar to auto-tune, but with a different voice. It wasn't that popular at the time. Still, I was glad to have such a friend who liked what I was doing. Things were going well for a while. I was making YouTube clips of anime and they were airing. He kept my old account in his account, and I even remember the moment when I showed him the song Luca, 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 Night Fever, and he added it to his favorites. One day I decided to add him to my favorites, which I was very happy about. However, he disappeared from my sight. He started acting differently and started calling me. I, on the other hand, was one of those who was used to him calling me. My classmates didn't have cell phones at the time, and I couldn't let my family know about my phone conversation with a stranger, so I tried to avoid talking to strangers on my home phone, politely apologized that I couldn't help you. However, to this day, I still distinctly remember his words. Call me or I will kill you. I could kill you and also sexually assault you. I did it, but I knew it was wrong, so I was in a panic and my lungs constricted. After vomiting, I immediately blocked it out. Yes, I should have called the police. I know I should have told my mom about it. And I know for a fact that I should have told my mom what happened, but I didn't because I was afraid of the consequences. Not that they would see me as nothing and the computer would be taken away from me. He was aware that I was 11 or 12 years old. Immediately after he realized what I had done, he sent an AIM spam bot on me, and it was immediate. It got to the point where he damaged my computer. They all had obscene sexual names. I discovered this in their names, started using a new account or name, but forgot about them immediately afterward. A while later, I checked YouTube again and saw that my new post was already there. Expecting to see it, I experienced excitement. It turned out to be a Swedish friend of mine who was about my age, and I quickly open it, and my heart starts beating faster that it's him, because I still remember that moment. As of today, he's still active on YouTube, and his account has a name, something like, "Hello, dear cousin. I got the Vocaloids program. Unblock me and I can send you a copy." I was aware of it. I can't forgive myself for what he said, and frankly, I was intimidated by what he said. However, I haven't blocked him on YouTube to this day, and I don't even know why that happened. Perhaps I had no idea how to log in, and that's what caused it. The messages keep coming in, and I have responded to a few of them. Most of them contain the words, "I miss you so much and want to hear back. I'm sorry for what happened." At some point, I even think he was actually in love with me. In order to draw attention to my YouTube account, I used my real first and last name and created it under an assumed name. Due to the fact that I had a lot more subscribers on my old account, I needed to replenish it. Doing so and uploading a video narrating that I was back, this happened 3 or 4 years ago, and at that point I received a message from one of my acquaintances. Looking in his YouTube channel, I found this song called Lou. There's this song called Luca, Luca, Luca Night Fever that's posted on his page. Deleted all the posts and deleted the video after that, but every time I got the posts, I deleted them and destroyed them. It always bothered me when I received a Facebook request message from a YouTube user, and it still bothers me to this day. It bothers me to this day. I have never been to the state of Connecticut, even though I really wanted to. I constantly worry about him realizing my face and approaching me. In the event that I'm honest, I have no idea if he has my information. I still have no idea where I live, and I have no idea if anyone even knows my number. I really hope that he doesn't know where I live, and as for the nose, I also really hope so. I feel like I'm never going back there again. Notable shadow figures. I am originally from the UK, and at the time of writing this story, I was 16 years old. I have just finished school and am currently a student. As I mentioned earlier, I have just graduated from high school and started at a local college. For several years now, I have been preoccupied with the question of how I would further my education. I had an experience that involved going on a week-long vacation to an outdoor activity center that was located in the woods. I was on a business trip in the northwest of England. This was my first time traveling independently outside of my home. We stayed in a hotel that was similar to a hostel. While on the trip, I settled in with 4 other girls in one room. We turned off the lights and drifted into sleep. I can't say exactly how long we spent in this state, but I was awakened by one of the girls. She said my name from the bottom bunk next to me and informed me that someone was in the room. She settled herself at the foot of my bed. When I turned to face her, I saw a shadow on the wall near the bed. I noticed that she was nestled at my feet, and then I saw several other shadows that were nearby. Around the room and the people who had settled down on the other beds, I noticed the same thing. My friend who first woke me up must have noticed it too. There were about 5 or 6 in total, and we had attracted a few more girls, which made it possible for them to see all the shadows in the room. And it didn't seem to be anything unusual, although we couldn't make sense of what was happening. Using gestures, we tried to show them our faces, but they looked too much like the boys in our class. I asked them for answers, but they didn't do anything but just stand or sit. And it was so horrible because they were just looking at us and we were yelling so loud. After one of the teachers rushed in, he heard the noise and then he turned on the line. There was no one there. At first I thought it was the boys playing a prank on us. But when the lights were turned on, they all disappeared. I always wondered what it could have been, and when they were dressed like the boys in her class, even I never felt the same. We were all in fear for our lives, so needless to say, we didn't have a good vacation. No one believed us that night, and we couldn't convince anyone the next day. I think it would be great if someone would give me something. Have any of you ever wondered why the shadows took on the appearance of my classmates, and what it might have meant? A possible explanation could be that this situation happened in the It Happened. I was 17 years old and spending the fall in Kempsey, Sydney, Australia. I was having a nice day when the following happened. I decided to take the train that ran from my house to the station where I lived. This would allow me to make a trip to the store for shopping at the same time. Gummy. I was ready to take a couple of dresses and a hat with me as soon as I decided to hit the road. Today was a beautiful day, and I couldn't pass up a delicious milkshake and a takeaway burger. The general seating area had trees and stores cluttering around me. I decided to rest here. While people watching, I ate in silence and watched people go about their business. However, I soon noticed a man beside me who was busy minding his own business. He was quite tall and tanned, had dark hair and sharp facial features. I could guess him to be in his early 30s, but I didn't think much of him. At first, he was just another person who was around me, oblivious to the fact that I was aware of his presence. I quietly went on with my day, buying a few more items of bare clothing as well as cute keychains. For a few months, I really enjoyed shopping without doing anything special. However, it was soon time for more important items to be purchased. After about 3 or 4 hours, I made the decision that I needed to go home. Encouraged by my purchases, I returned to the train station and stopped in front of a map of the railroad tracks. I could not determine which platform I should arrive at home. I had to stand in silence for a few minutes until someone patted me on the shoulder. Seeing him again for the first time, it was somewhat puzzling that it was the same person as before. He was a tall, brown-haired man with dark hair and the same facial features. I asked him about his facial features, to which he replied, "Do you need help?" Once again, he uttered his innocuous phrase, "Yes, please." Truth be told, I was relieved to have an adult support me on the way home, because I was anxious and fearful that I might get lost. It's not the first time I've missed or ended up on the wrong train, and then the men asked me where I was going. I managed to explain to him, after which he showed me the platform, and I so simply asked him to show me. And yes or no, while I was waiting for an answer to my question, I saw him again on the stairs. He slowly made his way down while looking around anxiously. I stood in front of him so that he would have to come home with me. Unfortunately, he almost walked up to me. I apologize, I was too close. I offered him to go home with me, but his tone became more emphatic, and I realized that he had made up his mind. I got the impression that he was being serious, and I felt uncomfortable when he kept talking. My temper was pretty unstable at the best of times. I've been like that all my life, so I've always been very nervous and anxious. I think I was too scared to even scream and make noise. Also, I worry that if I keep yelling, I might hurt myself or others around me. This man was trying to do something. He could have done it. "Sir, I don't think I can say I did anything." I tried to resist at first, but he didn't let me finish. "You're coming with me." His speech became even harsher, and with that, unfortunately, came the train. I had the urge to refuse him again. However, he snatched my bag and shopping bags from my hands and then headed towards the train. They disappeared, and I ran after them to get them back. People were following him. Doors were closing behind the men, but I was still holding my things, asking me to go into Seaton's, as he still had my things. I did so, and spent some time by his side without uttering a word. I felt perfectly calm and unconcerned as I suddenly felt a real fear creeping up on me. Nothing good about it, but it made me want to cry. The next stop was my new one. While he still had my back, did I have the right to drop my things in his presence? He could have just run away, but he had my papers, passport, and bank cards, which seemed even more unbelievable. Despite the fear I felt, sitting here was just as dangerous. I had a need to do something, and I took a minute to come to my senses and then looked up again. Beginning to realize that we were still in a fairly remote location from home, I tried to look at the situation more rationally. I could watch the creeper next to me cautiously, but I needed to see his work. On this phone were my photos. In these photos, I am looking at a map of the train station, as well as photos of me looking at the dresses that are hanging on the hangers. The place where I am waiting to cross the road had pictures of me. He took a lot of pictures of me just living my day. I was so careless at that moment that I didn't pay attention to it. It's so good that now I can reminisce about it in hindsight. Get off this train and do it right now. I pretended as my cell phone rang. I managed to talk to a few people on the phone, but I couldn't get the attention of the passengers sitting in the lounge. In fact, they were more annoyed or curious about what I was doing than concerned about me. At that moment, I no longer felt trapped by the man who was trying to get me to go home with him. Mar, who was sitting across from me, leaned back in his chair slightly, and I used my fake phone to call him to show him that Mar was in a hurry to get home. To my sister's request to calm her down, none of the men responded. I noticed that people turned in my direction as I pulled my bags out of the trunk. At that moment, I felt like a complete idiot for making such remarks. It was very embarrassing, but necessary. The moment my bags were returned to me, I walked to the train door and made a fake phone call as soon as it opened. When the doors opened, I was relieved and put the phone in my pocket, then continued on my way. Yet it turned out to be only a short wait when it rang. At that moment, someone ran up behind me and grabbed my shoulder. I turned around and then felt his hand on my waist. In response, I tried to refuse, but at that moment he snatched my cell phone. I couldn't refuse him as he pulled out his phone and opened the dialing function on it. He then showed it to me and asked me to give him my cell phone number. On the condition that it is not yours, you will have to come with me to my house. His words continued to scare me. I then made the decision that I should comply, but instead I turned around and walked home in intense fear and panic, crying and looking around in panic all the way home, just to be home sooner. I still have those messages, and they show that I still have them. I'm drawn to you. I'm going to your house to find you. You could give me your address and invite me to travel inland. What have you done for that? If you have any problems, I can help you with money or food. Come to my house tonight. Upon returning home, I immediately reported the incident to my aunt and uncle, who were also living at the time. We then went to the police station to file a report. I managed to give them his phone number, text, and tell them everything. Search. I still can't figure out what happened to him at the time or where he is now. I can only hope that this is the worst thing he has done to anyone ever. He was so horrible that he was feared, and he could always do what he planned to do to someone. His appearance inspired fear. In high school, I realized that some of the most beneficial purchases were the most common. When I was 17 years old, I made the decision to get my driver's license. I couldn't spend that much time with my parents anymore because they weren't bad people, but I was bored with it. When I got my license, my mom started running a political news channel with my dad, but it quickly became obsolete. There was a text service called QWERTY. It ceased operations and I was left without a phone as it was no longer part of the business. I had to buy my own phone as my parents decided I needed one. They were getting money for it, and I had to do all the chores around the house to pay for it. Even though I didn't live in the most disadvantaged neighborhood, Radio Shack was in a dangerous part of town. There were a large number of prostitutes and drug dealers. I never heard of anyone getting hurt. But the people who were there were definitely very unclean, and one apartment down the road from Radio Shack was very dangerous and was used for opioid use. Unlike most people who are pro-drugs and drug dealers, it was closer to my house than I would have imagined. I hardly thought about it all this time, and here I am, here at Radio Shack, and I have a lot to think about. There is a tendency to make the process more complicated, starting with the girl who checked me out first, and only then started activating the phone. She managed to break the phone only after she not only activated it incorrectly, but damaged it. After we set everything up, they gave me the task of installing security on my workplace. I made a backup code, which I did, but it's just one of those codes that you can use. I ended up getting it as soon as I moved to my dad's truck. Drove back at 8 a.m. I was forced to stop at an intersection as it was the location of a drug house apartment. The road is deserted from west to east, while two other people are traveling in the same direction as him. One truck turns right. One of the trucks turns right to travel northbound, and the man stays northwest and waits for us as we turn east. At a red traffic light, an orange PT Cruiser pulled up ahead of me. He started waiting for the truck to turn so he could pass. I didn't even pay attention to the pedestrian, but he had already crossed the road, and the light was green and we were still standing still. I decided to look in the mirror and signal before I moved off. I pressed the signal, and the car in front of me backed up a bit, which put me in a stupor and forced me to take a step back. Getting behind the wheel for the first time, I decided not to use the car's reverse. I put it in a parking spot and started driving, pressing the gas, not moving, and trying to figure out what position I'm in. There's no way I can find the screen. Panic, and the orange PT Cruiser goes airborne. I still can't get over the guy who was in the road ahead of me, and I always feel uneasy about him when I have to move. He had 5'6" height in his build and was quite tall with long limbs. Everything about him screamed zombie, and his face was contorted with a grimace of anger. I only got a glimpse of him due to the fact that he was dressed in dirty clothes of a neutral color, but due to the darkness, I couldn't make out his face. With my efforts, I managed to lock the doors, but I still couldn't figure out their mechanisms. I froze, staring at him. He touched the hood of the car and it cracked. I saw everything in his face, the bruises and the dirt. I was so frightened by what I saw that I had to take a chance and look him in the eye. And I'll never forget that moment. I couldn't understand why he was covered in blood. I had no doubt that he was hurt because his face looked so dirty and scarred to me. He crept over to the car and started looking for the handbrake while I tried to figure out the operation of the gears. I succeeded in shifting the gear into neutral, and the truck made a strange sound that made him cower, but mine didn't move and kept going. With his face pressed against the window, he felt like blood was streaming out of his eyes, but he wasn't in pain. I could hear him laughing as he tried to calm me down, and I could feel his grip on the door handle. Not a single car stopped to help me. I saw them driving by, though. I managed to find the right gear and try to take off, but for some stupid reason I couldn't do it. I had a goal to be a decent human being and not get in his way, so I tried to drive off as slowly as possible. Just before I could hit the gas, he pulled out a gun. I screamed and pointed the gas in his direction. I dragged the gas for a bit, then he grabbed the side mirror and I let him go. After that, I headed down Route 35 to my house, but when I reached it, I got a real shock. My mom was angry that I had broken into her house, as I did when I tried to explain to her the reason for my action. When I tried to explain it to my bashfulness, I started to turn inside out and had to leave the premises before I entered the house. I managed to explain that they wanted to tell me to stop being a coward and call the police. However, this did not happen. I had to call the police for help because I was almost carjacked. The dispatcher informed me that I was not the only one who contacted him about the man with bloodshot eyes after telling my parents about the incident. In my opinion, my mom was pretty skeptical. However, the doorbell rang and a sheriff's deputy came to see her. My mom asked me to go to the officer with the hope that he could help me in exposing the prank or to apologize. In the process of apologizing, he asked me for a description after I gave him a description and walked him to the truck to show him. I gave him a description and walked him to the truck to show him the blood trail on the window, but he had someone take a sample and inform me that they had a suspect. As I said earlier, a man matching my descriptions completely was apprehended. He had a rash on his injured shoulder that was caused by a road infection. The police officer gave me his identification number and his license plate number and asked me to call him if I needed assistance in the matter. As time passed, he appeared on the local news talking about the events that had occurred. In an attempted car robbery by a man who was rumored to be using cocaine, he stated that it was due to his addiction to the drug. With the help of witnesses and descriptions and the fact that he had a unique trauma, it was easy to find the right person. The right person was found quite simply. He had a gun loaded with ammunition that had not been used. No one other than himself was injured. A deputy reported that the man was involved in a scuffle that occurred nearby and was injured. He suffered beatings and bleeding from his eyes, which was caused by ruptured blood vessels in his eyes. His words confirmed that the man was in stable condition and taking part in work. He was subsequently sentenced to prison for drug possession and has not been heard from since, yet I had never heard from him until the time he used a firearm. It scared me half to death. There is my story. I was 19 years old when I left my hometown and moved to a larger metropolitan area in order to attend a university. I had been working throughout the previous summer at 2 jobs. We also had sales at a medieval store that is part of a larger chain. It had an assortment of outfits, weapons, jewelry, and gargoyles, and all sorts of figurines and trinkets, and I was very good. The moment I told my management that I was going to leave my post and wanted to quit, he took my words to heart. I can confirm that one of the chain stores has an employee that is really needed in the exact city I am moving to. He was thrilled with my impression, so he decided to send me a resume for consideration. It informed me that it would be happy to hire me as soon as I moved. At the end of the summer, I moved to the big city and started working in September. In order to start working in a new place, I need to describe the environment. The store was located in the oldest neighborhood, which had 375 households. The buildings in question have a long history, as the street was very winding and long. Being on a street that was cobblestone and filled with tourists in the summer, the store was one of the most popular places to shop. The narrow store space was located at the very top of the building, making it very small. At 16 feet wide and 465 feet deep, the cathedral had a ceiling height of 25 feet. The upper floors housed the most popular bars and pubs, but only one of them was directly facing the street. In the center was a large display case where we placed mannequins dressed in our merchandise, and in the back of the store was a small display case where our merchandise was placed. There was another display case that was decorated with mannequins but without a door, as the street that ran parallel to our house was actually only 35 meters further away. Since the street that ran parallel to our house was actually only 35 feet lower, and the town itself was in very unstable terrain, so each street that went down to the river was lower than the other. This makes a big difference to the story, as there is only one entrance to the store, and it is very important. As soon as I crossed the threshold of the store, I immediately headed toward the front door. From the feel of the place, I realized that it was too stuffy and the air seemed heavy. I immediately felt uncomfortable, but I couldn't turn down a job that paid good money. With my student work, I was doing great. I knew what needed to be done, and that suited me just fine. So I just decided to bury my fears and get to work. Everything worked out fine. I made friends with the manager, who was well connected, and also met new colleagues. As a result, we came to an understanding. But when I had to do the work or close the store alone, I felt insecure. The narrow and dark store was filled with mirrors, gargoyle statues, swords, and mannequins. During the closed-door battle with the mannequins and swords, it was necessary to go all the way to the back of the room. Once out of the storeroom, you must turn off all the switches and then return to the back of the store in pitch darkness to find yourself in complete darkness again. To leave the house through the front door, needless to say, I did it practically running, right after the lights were turned off. Now we could try to solve the problem by replacing all the anxiety with pleasant memories. I never once felt anything like this in my store, which was in my hometown where I used to work. In fact, it was a store in my hometown that was located in its historic part. It was located in a really old building. I felt weird for a month or two. We felt uneasy, but we couldn't say with absolute certainty that something was really going on there. The next year in the late fall on Halloween Eve, I realized that this is just a stereotype. Events began to happen, and I witnessed them happen. Upon arriving at the store in the early morning hours, I discovered a huge gargoyle. Clearly not meant to stand on a shelf, it was about 16 feet taller than it, and was positioned in the center of the room as if it had been placed there on purpose. In reality, it was not a white gargoyle. I'll disclaim at once. After that incident, I experienced some anxiety. I kept coming across strange objects that appeared in unusual places. For example, we see various objects in our bathroom, statuettes on the walls, things on the shelves changing places, and so on. In passing, without warning, the steps appeared, then the floor of the store. The store was set up on old, worn wood with a very unpleasant creak. The light weight on it, in turn, provoked it to creak and crack in the most obvious way, causing it to vibrate constantly. And even if no one who saw it stepped on it, it still remained invisible. One day, as I stood behind the cash register minding my own business, I heard someone's footsteps. It happened that evening while I was busy with my work. I met my manager, whose name is Jay, and told him about some unusual things happening here. She was supposed to be pleased to hear me laugh and reassure me that I was making it up. But I realized from her expression that she wasn't the only one. Everything she had told me about the things I was interested in was laid out for her. The rich atmosphere of moving furniture, clattering stairs, things flying off shelves, and a sense of total freedom makes you wonder what is going on in the world. Anxiety is heightened by the fact that Jay is one of the most skeptical people around. Met her, she was terrified, and I realized she was the kind of person I know. And so I got confirmation of the fact that at least some of my experiences were completely unrealistic. I worked at that company all winter, and things gradually stabilized, although some things were still volatile. However, I was starting to get used to what was going on. I got used to the dampness and was only a little annoyed when I woke up in the morning and found things in unusual places. After the onset of summer, the situation began to escalate. To whatever extent the space was inhabited, it realized that it was not enough to move items around, provide opportunities for all employees to joke about themselves and us, not just me, but the entire team. Even my personal manager has TSP sensitivity. An employee who had a negative attitude towards those around her started to get nervous. Came in one morning to clean the floor near the changing booths, which were covered with large mirrors. According to her, in the reflection she saw an unfamiliar figure that was clearly not hers. That evening she was behind the cash register by the door when I arrived at work. She looked very shaken up. In fact, they had spent the entire day on the move, avoiding going near mirrors, and frankly, I didn't really want to know the reason for their fear of them. She didn't elaborate on the details and told me about how she just brushed everything off. She was feeling something she had never experienced before, and it was scary because she was scared of another staff member. Tentatively not the intimidating type, a large man with a rather skeptical attitude about his views and actions. We were terrified of his taunts, but one evening when he left, we still felt his presence. There was a big difference between him and his male colleague in what he felt, the cold and hard hand that was between them. He felt himself being pushed, and it was very unpleasant because he was able to feel the cold as well as the strong hand that was between his shoulder blades. It was the roughest physical situation that has ever happened to any of us. I am curious as to why you chose one of the most skeptical people for this action. However, he was clearly scared and tried to explain it away. Still, how do you explain a cold hand pushing you around in a store where nothing is that neat? He was very tall and seemed to tower over all of us by a whole head. As such, anything concerning him had to be discussed with H, who was in close proximity to us and was behind the cash register 12 feet away. He didn't feel like he was being touched. He had one of the scariest experiences he had this summer. While I had just started working, he was in the middle of packing something for a customer one busy day. In the corner behind the cash register, he had placed some swords that he needed. This was necessary to create a stronger wall around the whole place, so should have placed heavier swords there. To make a choice, you were forced to constantly lock yourself to the heavy padlock brackets that were constantly at your disposal. To unlock the sword because it was causing pain in your anus area, but still managed to find a way to do so. One of the swords fell out of one of the brackets for no reason. Unexpectedly, it struck him in the face, meaning we kept their swords. The conditions under which the brace was closed were religiously closed, and the likelihood of anyone being able to use it was minimal. Even so, even back then, they were quite heavy, and it took some force to get them off the brackets. Alas and poor H had to get 4 stitches in his cheek. This incident changed his character. He was no longer the same, and it was reflected in his behavior. I think he was very sensitive and undoubtedly picked up on my thoughts. There was a negative energy centered in the store, so he decided to quit the following year. I just became apprehensive about working on my own, and needless to say, I was totally incapable of the job. M, who was the only one of us who wasn't hurt, seemed to remain intact. All of M's co-workers were in a state of hysteria and laughter as he watched us work. At points, we talked about what was going on. This building was built in the last century, so things are accumulating on the walls. She thought someone was using the spare key to play a trick on her. I think she couldn't believe we were all crazy and thought it was consensual. Perhaps the rejection was a cause for concern or annoyance of whatever was stalking our store. Some escalation of events was caused by the entity becoming more aggressive. At some point, it started destroying things, and when we would come to work, we would find broken items in our closets, and items made of wood would bounce and fall near us. We could hear them hitting the walls. Furniture rattling in the utility room. They were having a rock, paper, scissors competition to determine who should be sent in there to shut off the noise. Because I was so scared, I decided to close the door. I asked my then lover to come and get me so I wouldn't have to lock myself in alone, and one day I was locked in alone. As I was searching for the box, The door slammed shut behind me. The key I had brought with me did not disappear. I'm very glad my manager Jay was there with a key to use as a spare to help me get out. At this point, we were all on edge except for Richie and her. Until one morning I saw an ant in my bed. Em had already arrived on site, and she had settled in next to the supervisor and started eating breakfast. She was in the back of the store at that moment and looked a little scared when I approached her to talk to her. She had such a heavy impression of the store when she first walked in. The store felt like it was filled with negative energy, and she made an attempt to get rid of it, but it was unsuccessful. Despite her best efforts, she couldn't get rid of the feeling that she was being watched, and she didn't like it. It was probably the fact that she could actually feel it physically that scared her the most, and hugely unfortunately, the feeling never went away, and she was forced to leave the company at the end of the summer. She was on edge every time she did her job and couldn't be herself, and bluntly told us that she felt like she knew what would happen if she stayed. It would be in her best interest to stay. She could lose her mind or something, and it wouldn't do her any good. You mean we were faced with the fact that our staff was on the upswing and ready to do the math, and we were not up to the task? People were seeing things reflected in mirrors, and even my not-so-spiritual staff member realized she had lost her mind a bit. Throughout the summer and fall, things got very strange and stressful. It was terrifying because my body was on alert mode, and I felt really bad. I needed to get out of there to recover. That's when I made my decision without hesitating for a second. I finally decided to let my manager know that I was done for the day, and it was time for me to go. She decided that I would leave this place and never come back here again, so we decided to just take her last item and leave without waiting for her. We didn't have to do any procedure to lock the switches. We took our keys and just set them in place. Soon they were outside. I left the place and never came back. The owners decided to close the business before the end of winter, and we all received unemployment benefits the following week. Unemployment pay was scheduled until they found suitable work or when they reopened in April or even sooner. When my supervisor called me and offered me a job, I told him I would rather die of fear of the store than accept the position. Often I pass by this building when my business takes me to the old part of town. Once upon a time long ago, this store was closed, and now it is empty. I often ran into the bar staff and waiters who worked on the upper floors. We often had sit-downs on our porches. While at work last summer, I was walking around the store's grounds and happened to run into one of them. And when I happened to run into one of the bar girls, we got into an argument. She told me that our store was currently empty and that all the customers had long since left. Whoever is a customer, whoever opens something, becomes redundant at the moment of rejection or change of mind. To begin with, I decided to try and check with Oscar to see if anything more strange was going on with Kenny. I had to show up at the bar, which was pretty weird, and she looked at me with great interest. "My chairs break all the time," she said. Bartenders and waiters who encounter broken bottles and falling tables, hearing strange noises at night, and many other things we talked and discussed for an hour afterward. I'm totally convinced it's a haunted building or something. Truth be told, it wouldn't surprise me at all in a part of town where most of the buildings are in pretty good condition. Most of the buildings are over 200 years old, but I can't figure out what it was. I never understood his motives, but one thing I was sure of was that he knew for sure he didn't need it. Let me be allowed to say that I am a scientist at heart. I don't consider myself a convinced skeptic, but I do enjoy logical reasoning. If I could find scientific explanations for any of the events I mentioned, I would gladly do so. If possible, I'd love to do it, but I can't find the words to explain it. I could explain why I worked there. I could explain the sense of anxiety and fear that encompassed me and the actions that took place there. And even in the present day, 10 years later, you can't pay me that amount of money to cover my services. There is no way to go back in a million years.